Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we crack open the most complex instruction manuals in biology and give you the knowledge you need in minutes. Today, we are going beyond the stable blueprint of DNA to explore the molecule that acts as the immediate dynamic instruction set for life, RNA.
Absolutely. The sources we've compiled, drawn largely from foundational biochemistry texts, really dig into the intricate, multi-step process required for RNA synthesis, processing, and modification. We're not just looking at a copy machine, we're looking at a cellular customization factory.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission is to trace the journey of genetic information, starting as just a small segment of DNA that is transcribed into a precursor RNA molecule. Then we need to follow that precursor through its rigorous finishing school, how it's cleaned up, cut, capped, and tailed to become a functional blueprint, an mRNA, or a critical regulatory element.
What's fascinating here is the sheer complexity of control and why this process is so biomedically relevant. This isn't just simple copying, it's the primary way an organism adapts. Altered rates of RNA synthesis and metabolism are exactly how differentiated cell structures and functions are established and how we respond to the environment. Crucially, errors,
Like,
whether in the initial synthesis, the precise splicing, or the final stability of these transcripts, are a direct cause of a vast array of human diseases.
before we get into the mechanics of building this, let's get acquainted with the classes of RNA we'll be dealing with. We have two major categories, starting with the one everyone knows, the protein-coding RNAs.
That is messenger RNA, or mRNA. It carries the instructions for making protein.
And it's super diverse, right?
Oh, highly diverse. We're talking about over 100,000 different species of mRNA. But, quantitatively, it's quite low in abundance, typically only 2 to 5% of the total RNA in a cell.
And its stability. It varies.
Wildly, because its job is often temporary, so some last for minutes, others for hours.
Then you have the bulk of RNA, the non-protein coding RNAs, or nCRNAs, which often have structural or regulatory jobs.
Exactly. And these range in size. The large ones include ribosomal RNA, or rRNA. This is the big kahuna of the cell, making up about 80% of total RNA.
Because it's the ribosome itself, basically.
It forms the core machinery, so it has to be extremely stable. We also have long non-coding RNAs, lncRNAs, which act in complex regulatory roles, making up maybe 1 or 2% of the total.
Okay, moving down to the small but mighty players.
These include transfer RNAs, or tRNAs. They are the essential adapter molecules that bring amino acids to the ribosome during translation. They make up about 15% of the total, and like RNA, they are very stable.
And then the really tiny regulators.
Regulatory workhorses. So you've got small nuclear RNAs, the snRNAs, which are vital for mRNA splicing, and then the micro and silencing RNAs, miRNAs, and cRNAs, which act as modulators of gene expression by tweaking the stability or translation rate of target mRNAs.
That sets the stage perfectly for transcription. It's helpful to ground ourselves by comparing RNA synthesis to DNA replication. We have similarities.
Yeah.
They both move in the 5' to 3' direction.
And they both use these large polymerization complexes and adhere strictly to Watson-Crick base pairing rules.
But the differences are profound and really
That's
speak to RNA's specialized role.
They really are. First, we use ribonucleotides, and uracil replaces thymine. Second, and this is a critical mechanism that saves time and energy, RNA polymerases initiate de novo.
No primer needed.
No primer needed to start the chain. Third, unlike DNA replication, which copies the entire genome, transcription is highly selective. Only tiny portions are vigorously copied at any given time.
And crucially, the system is less protected.
That's right. Transcription has no highly active, efficient proofreading function. If DNA polymerase makes a mistake, the daughter cell may be compromised. If RNA polymerase makes a mistake,
The cell just degrades that one faulty protein and moves on.
exactly. The trade-off for speed and selectivity is a reduced error correction system.
So given that selectivity, how does the RNA polymerase know which of the two DNA strands to read?
That's the template logic. The enzyme reads the template strand in the 3' to 5' direction. The sequence of the new RNA molecule is complementary to that template.
And the other strand?
The other strand is called the coding strand because, except for U replacing T, its sequence matches the RNA transcript exactly. What's crucial is that this designation isn't permanent across the whole helix. The template for one gene can be the coding strand for a different gene right next door.
Got it. Now, defining the start and end points. The enzyme binds a specific DNA region called the promoter. Transcription officially starts at the transcription start site, or TSS, which we designate +1.
Right, and everything after that is positive numbers, exons, and introns, while the regulatory regions located before the start site, like the -35 or -10 boxes, are negative numbers.
Let's start with the basic engine in bacteria like E. coli.
Okay. The core RNA polymerase is massive. 2 alpha, 2 large beta and beta prime, and an omega subunit. The beta subunit contains the catalytic magnesium ion site.
That core complex can polymerize, but it can't find the right start point. So what converts that general copier into a smart recognition engine?
That is the role of the sigma factor. It associates with the core enzyme to form the holoenzyme. The sigma factor is the key regulatory component because it guides the complex to recognize and bind the promoter region.
So it's a targeting system.
It is. It allows the formation of the preinitiation complex.
So this competition model, where different sigma factors compete for the limiting core enzyme, that's essentially a master cellular switch.
Precisely. It allows the bacterium to instantly pivot its entire gene expression program. If nutrients are scarce or the temperature suddenly spikes, a different sigma factor will take over, redirecting the transcription machinery to the set of genes necessary for immediate survival.
Like the heat shock response.
Exactly, or sporulation. It's brilliant regulatory efficiency.
Okay, let's walk through the 6 steps of the transcription cycle.
Step 1. It starts when the holoenzyme finds and binds the DNA promoter, forming the closed complex. Step 2. The complex then unwinds about 20 base pairs of DNA to form the open complex.
Allowing access to the template.
Right. Step 3 is chain initiation, where the RNA peak couples the first 2 ribonucleotides.
Then step 4 is promoter clearance. Once the RNA chain hits about 10 to 20 nucleotides, the polymerase undergoes a major conformational change, moves away, and often the sigma factor is released to go help another core enzyme start.
5 is elongation. The RNA chain grows 5' to 3', anti-parallel to the template. The release of pyrophosphate, Ppi, and its subsequent breakdown makes the entire reaction highly irreversible, pushing the process forward.
And I imagine that moving enzyme causes a lot of tension in the DNA.
Massive superhelical tension, which means topoisomerases are absolutely necessary to relieve that tension both ahead of and behind the moving RNAP.
Finally, we hit step 6, termination. How does the enzyme get the signal to stop in prokaryotes?
There are 2 main methods. About half the genes rely on an accessory termination protein called the Rho factor. This factor binds to a specific C-rich region on the transcript called a RUT site.
And it just chases the polymerase down.
It uses its built-in ATPase activity to chase down the paused RNAP, leading to dissociation.
And the second method relies purely on structure.
Correct. Rho-independent termination. The DNA template contains inverted repeats, which are transcribed into a nascent RNA that forms a stable, dramatic hairpin structure.
And that hairpin physically stalls the polymerase.
It causes the RNAP to pause, and the pause is followed by an A-rich template stretch, which provides the weak RNA-DNA pairing needed to induce the final termination and release.
Okay, so the jump from that prokaryotic engine to the eukaryotic system really emphasizes the degree of control needed in complex organisms. We move from one multi-subunit polymerase to 3 distinct nuclear polymerase.
We have Pol I, which transcribes ribosomal RNA genes, Pol II, which handles the most diverse array, including mRNA, snRNA, mRNA, and lncRNA, and Pol III, which transcribes tRNA and the small 5S RNA genes.
Is there a way scientists distinguish between these 3 polymerases in the lab?
There is, and it's a classic example from toxicology. The compound is alpha-ammonidin, a peptide toxin from the death cap mushroom.
The famous poison.
It's a specific differential inhibitor. Pol I is insensitive. Pol III shows intermediate sensitivity. But Pol II, the one responsible for every protein blueprint, has very high sensitivity to this toxin, making it a powerful research tool.
Now let's talk eukaryotic promoters. In eukaryotes, the promoter needs to control 2 things. Fidelity, where exactly to start, and frequency, how often to start. Where do we see fidelity control?
Fidelity is primarily driven by positioning elements. Pol II commonly uses the TATA box, located about -25 base pairs upstream, to correctly position the enzyme.
But not all genes have a TATA box.
Right, many are TATA-less. And for those, the enzyme relies on the initiator sequence, or INR, which spans the start site itself, and sometimes the downstream promoter element, or DPE, located around +25. These work together to precisely define that +1 start site.
So TATA, NR, and DPE handle where to start. What dictates the rate, the frequency of initiation?
Those are the upstream elements, or proximal control elements. Think of the GC box and the CAT box. These can be located several hundred base pairs upstream and mutations in them can dramatically reduce the frequency of transcription, sometimes 10 to 20-fold.
And stepping even further away, you have the truly long-distance regulators, enhancers and silencers.
Exactly. These can be located thousands of bases away, often within introns or even downstream of the gene, yet they physically loop back to influence the promoter.
And they can be flipped around and still work.
They function in an orientation-independent fashion. It's amazing. They are the elements that allow for sophisticated transcription regulation in response to complex external signals, like tissue-specific cues or hormonal signals.
The crucial functional difference in eukaryotes is that Pol IIs cannot bind the promoter alone. It requires the assembly of the PIC using general transcription factors, or GTFs.
Right. The assembly always starts with TFID, which contains the TATA-binding protein, or TBP. TFID is the only GTF that can bind independently to the TATA box with high affinity.
And when it binds, it actually bends the DNA.
It causes a dramatic 100-degree kink in the DNA helix. This structural change is what cues the rest of the sequential assembly, creating a complex that ultimately spans about 60 base pairs around the start site. TBP is so fundamental that it's also required for Pol I and Pol III transcription.
But wait, if the DNA is all wrapped up in nucleosomes, how does TFID or any other GTF even reach the TATA box in the first place?
This is where chromatin regulation, the ultimate gatekeeper in eukaryotes, comes in. Promoters are typically occluded because the DNA is wrapped around histone proteins, forming nucleosomes. Transcription won't start until this barrier is overcome.
So the promoter needs to be opened.
Precisely. Activator proteins bind the distal enhancers, and then they recruit powerful complexes known as co-regulators. These fall into two main types: chromatin remodelers, like Swissinf, which physically move or eject nucleosomes.
And modifying factors.
Right, like HITs, which acetylate histones, or SETs, which methylate them. These modifications are part of the epigenetic code, effectively tagging the DNA to open the promoter, finally allowing the GTFs and Pol II to assemble the active PIC. If that remodeling doesn't happen, the gene stays silent.
As Pol II finally moves into elongation, we see the importance of its unique structure, specifically the carboxyl terminal domain, or CTD.
The CTD is a long tail containing many repeated heptad sequences, 7 amino acids that recur over and over, phosphorylation of specific serine residues on this tail.
That's the trigger.
It's essential for Pol II to clear the promoter and move forward. But here's where it gets really interesting. The phosphorylated CTD acts as a critical binding platform. It recruits mRNA processing enzymes.
So it connects the beginning of transcription with the next steps.
It effectively couples transcription initiation directly with subsequent mRNA processing events like capping, splicing, and 3' end formation. It's a masterpiece of efficiency.
Let's move to that processing phase, because the primary transcript, the pre-mRNA, is almost never ready for translation right away.
Nearly all eukaryotic primary transcripts are made as precursors that must be extensively process-cleaved, modified, and edited while still in the nucleus before they can be exported to the cytoplasm.
Okay, so the transcript gets a hat and a tail. What are those?
At the 5' end, a 7-methylguanosine cap is added almost immediately. This cap has dual roles. It protects the transcript from 5' exonucleases, which would otherwise chew it up.
And it's needed for translation.
Absolutely required for translation initiation. Then, at the 3' end, the precursor is cleaved downstream of an AAUAA signal, and polymerase adds a tail of about 200 A residues.
Also for protection and translation.
Exactly. That poly A tail protects the 3' end and facilitates translation.
In between those ends, we have the most dramatic restructuring event, splicing. We have to precisely remove non-protein coding introns and accurately join the protein coding exons.
This is a phenomenal feat of molecular engineering carried out by the spliceosome, a giant dynamic complex. It's made up of the precursor RNA, 5 different small nuclear RNAs, and associated proteins, all forming snRNPs.
Can you walk us through the basic mechanism that this spliceosome performs?
It's a 2-step transesterification reaction. First, U1 binds the 5' donor site, and U2 binds the branch site, which contains a reactive I residue. That reactive A then performs a nucleophilic attack on the 5' donor site.
Which creates the unique loop of RNA.
Yes, the lariat structure, held together by an unusual 5' to 2' phosphodiester bond.
A lariat structure, like a cowboy's rope, is the signature of this specific splicing mechanism.
Exactly. A second cut and ligation then joins the 2 exons together, releasing that lariat, which is subsequently degraded. This requirement for such precise cuts is why single nucleotide mutations at an exon-intron junction can cause disease, as seen in some forms of beta thalassemia.
But the cell uses this complex system to its great advantage through alternative splicing.
Oh, alternative splicing is vital for maximizing genetic output. By selectively using alternative donor or acceptor sites, or including or excluding entire exons, the cell can create hundreds of different functional mRNAs and proteins from a single gene.
And a related brilliant strategy for control is alternative promoter use, where the same protein is expressed in different locations but regulated completely differently.
The glucokinase, or GK gene, is the perfect illustration. The GK protein structure is identical whether it's made in the liver or the pancreatic beta cell. However,
The regulation is different.
completely different. In the liver, GK is controlled by an insulin-responsive promoter. In the beta cell, it's controlled by a different promoter that responds directly to glucose. Same final enzyme, but its tissue-specific role is determined entirely by which promoter the cell chooses to activate.
Before we wrap up processing, we need to touch on microRNAs, the potent gene silencers. How are they born?
MicroRNA biogenesis is a complex cascade. It starts when Pol II transcribes a long primary mRNA, which is capped and polyadenylated. This long transcript forms a hairpin structure, which is processed in the nucleus by the Drosha DGCR8 nuclease complex.
It's then shipped out of the nucleus and processed further in the cytoplasm.
Correct. Exportin 5 takes it out, and once in the cytoplasm, the Dicer TRBP complex performs a second cut, trimming it down to a small 21 to 22 mer duplex. One strand is then selected and loaded into the RASC complex.
And once it's in RASC, it's active.
Once loaded into RASC, the mature mRNA can modulate gene expression by causing target mRNA degradation or repressing translation.
Finally, we have to talk about the surprising exceptions to this central dogma. RNA editing. This is post-transcriptional change of coding information.
RNA editing is truly remarkable because it means the mRNA sequence is deliberately different from the underlying DNA. The canonical example is the apolipoprotein B, or ApoB, gene. In the liver, the full mRNA directs synthesis of the large protein, APO100,
But the exact same primary transcript, when expressed in the intestine,
is targeted by a cytidine deaminase enzyme. This enzyme converts a single CAA codon, which encodes glutamine, into UAA,
a stop codon.
a termination signal. This single nucleotide change post-transcription creates the truncated ApoB48 protein instead. You get two functionally different proteins from the same gene with tissue-specific roles controlled purely by editing. It's an incredibly powerful mechanism.
And as a final note, we should mention that not all RNA is just information or structure. Some RNA molecules can even act as enzymes.
Yes, these are called ribozymes, and their catalytic power is seen in processes like certain splicing reactions and fundamentally in the peptidyl transferase activity of the RNA within the ribosome itself.
That was a deep and extensive dive into the RNA universe. Let's quickly summarize the 3 key takeaways you should walk away with today. First, the sheer scale of control in eukaryotes is massive, requiring 3 distinct polymerases, Pol I, II, and III.
Second, the process of initiating transcription in eukaryotes must overcome the major physical barrier of the nucleosome. PIC formation is complex, absolutely requiring multiple GTFs and the action of co-regulators like chromatin remodelers and histone-modifying factors to open up that promoter.
And third, the resulting precursor RNA transcripts are useless without extensive and precise post-transcriptional processing. This involves the protection added by the 5' cap and 3' tail, and the incredibly complex removal of introns via the spliceosome.
Which raises an important question for you to consider. Given the incredible power of processes like RNA editing, where a single nucleotide change post-transcription can completely alter a protein's function and size in a tissue-specific manner, like that ApoB example, how much hidden regulatory power still lies in these fine-tuned post-transcriptional modifications that we're just beginning to catalog and understand?
A truly profound thought to mull over. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the immediate blueprint of life. We hope you feel much more informed and ready to tackle your next challenge. We'll see you next time.